The Council crossed the line. Now humanity walks away from peace. Part 2. The Silence That Shook the Stars. The recall order reached every corner of Concord space within 6 hours. It traveled through secure channels, encoded and encrypted, bouncing from relay to relay until it landed on every human datapad, console, and communicator in the galaxy. The message was short. The meaning was clear. Come home. Bring everything. Leave nothing behind. Lieutenant Commander Kyle Mercer received the order at 3 a.m, station time. He was aboard research platform Valon 7, a small human outpost orbiting a gas giant in the Valon system. The station had a crew of 46, scientists, engineers, and support staff, who had spent the last 3 years mapping the nebula that stretched across the system like a river of light. Kyle read the message twice. Then he got out of bed, pulled on his uniform, and walked down the corridor to the crew quarters. He knocked on the door of his second-in-command, a systems engineer named Grace Dunlap. Grace opened the door with bleary eyes. She took one look at Kyle's face and said, "How bad?" "We're leaving," Kyle said. "Full recall. Everyone goes. Everything goes." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "The shared servers?" "Purge them. Every human file, every dataset, every scan. If we collected it, we erase it." Grace leaned against the doorframe. She looked past Kyle through the narrow viewport at the end of the corridor, where the nebula glowed in soft shades of blue and violet. They had named every gas cloud in that nebula. They had cataloged every star within it. 3 years of painstaking work, all stored on those servers and shared freely with the Concord. "They will lose the whole dataset," Grace said quietly. Kyle met her eyes. That is their problem now. By dawn, the station was alive with activity. Crew members packed personal belongings into duffel bags. Hard drives were wiped. Instruments were disconnected and crated. The shared database, containing over 9,000 files of stellar cartography, mineral analysis, and atmospheric modeling, was deleted line by line. Grace supervised the purge personally, running 3 verification passes to make sure nothing recoverable remained. At 0700, Kyle gathered the crew in the mess hall. He stood at the front of the room and looked at their faces. Some were confused. Some were angry. A few looked relieved, as though they had been waiting for this day without knowing it. "I am not going to sugarcoat this," Kyle said. "The Council voted to strip our territorial claims in closed session. They violated their own charter to do it. Not one species spoke up for us. So we are done. We are going home, and we are taking everything we built with us." A young geologist named Becky Harper raised her hand. "What about the Orvin team on Deck 4? They have been working with us on the mineral surveys for 6 months. Kyle paused. The Orvin researchers had become friends with several of his crew. They ate meals together. They played cards on Friday nights. Leaving them behind felt personal in a way that made Kyle's chest tight. "They are Concord personnel," Kyle said. "They will be fine. But our data goes with us. All of it." Nobody argued. They packed up and boarded the transport shuttle within 4 hours. As the shuttle pulled away from Valon 7, Grace sat by the viewport and watched the station shrink behind them. The lights were still on, but the corridors inside were empty now, just hollow metal floating in the dark. Across the Concord, the same scene played out again and again. On the Thessic border world of Rethan, a team of 12 human doctors had been running a medical clinic for nearly a decade. The clinic treated a respiratory plague that had been slowly spreading through the Thessic population for generations. Human medicine had not cured it, but it had managed it, kept the death rate low, kept the symptoms controlled, kept entire communities alive. Dr. Nate Garrison was the head of that clinic. He was a tall, soft-spoken man who had delivered babies in that clinic, held dying patients' hands, and trained an entire generation of Thessic medical students. When the recall order arrived, Nate sat at his desk for a long time before he moved. His assistant, a nurse named Carla Webb, found him staring at the wall. "We have to go," Carla said gently. "I know," Nate said. He pressed his palms flat on the desk. "Pack the equipment. Transfer what patient records we can to the Thessic staff. Leave them the treatment protocols at least." Carla hesitated. "The order says to take everything." Nate closed his eyes. "I know what the order says. But these are patients, Carla. They did not vote against us. They did not sit in that chamber and say nothing." He opened his eyes. "Leave them the protocols. I will answer for it if I have to." They left Rethon 3 days later. The Thessic medical staff stood in the doorway of the clinic and watched the human shuttle lift off. None of them spoke. A few of the younger students were crying. The plague would not wait for politics. On the Orvon Combine Central Trade Hub, the fusion relay that powered commerce across 6 systems went dark at exactly midnight on the 7th day after the recall. Human engineers had built that relay from the ground up. It was the single most important piece of infrastructure in Orvon space, and it ran on human-designed software with human-maintained hardware. When the last human technician, a quiet woman named Sophie Grant, powered down the main reactor, she left a single note on the control console. It read, "Good luck." The Orvon trade authorities scrambled to restart the relay. They could not. The system architecture was human, and the documentation had been wiped along with everything else. Within 48 hours, cargo ships began stacking up at transit points. Perishable goods spoiled in their holds. Contracts were broken. Prices surged. On the Felhari homeworld, the merchant guilds discovered that their entire navigation network, a system of software and satellite links designed and licensed by human engineers, had been deactivated. Ships that had flown the same routes for decades suddenly could not calculate a safe jump. The Felhari had never bothered to develop their own system. Why would they? The humans had always provided one. 2 weeks after the recall began, the complaints started pouring into Helix Prime. Every species had a grievance. The Orvon wanted their relay fixed. The Thessic wanted their doctors back. The Felhari wanted their navigation software restored. Smaller species that had depended on human technical support for everything from water purification to crop management sent increasingly desperate messages. Vathari Sen addressed the council with his usual calm authority. He stood at the center of the chamber and spread his long arms wide. "The humans are throwing a tantrum," he said. "This is the behavior of a young and emotional species. They will realize soon enough that they need us far more than we need them. When their anger fades, they will come back. They always do." The chamber was quiet. A few delegates nodded. Most did not. Weeks passed. The humans did not come back. Ambassador Yethari Mal of the Lasari Republics watched her economy take a slow, painful hit. The Lasari had deep trade connections with Earth, and the severing of those connections was bleeding her people dry. She requested a private audience with Secretary General Catherine Hale through every back channel she could find. Catherine declined. The response came through a junior communications officer and contained a single sentence. "Earth is no longer accepting diplomatic communications from Concord member states." Yethari read that sentence 5 times. She had known Daniel Locke for years. She had watched him walk out of the chamber and done nothing. She had told herself it was politics, that it was not personal, that it would blow over. Now she sat alone in her office on Helix Prime and stared at the wall. Her aide, a young Lasari named Torin, entered the room with another stack of economic reports. "How bad?" Yethari asked, without looking up. "Bad," Torin said, "and getting worse." Yethari finally turned to face him. Her expression was one that Torin had never seen before. It was not anger. It was something closer to shame. "I think we have made a terrible mistake," she said. Torin did not disagree. Out in the dark between the stars, human ships moved steadily homeward. They carried scientists and doctors and engineers and diplomats. They carried crates of equipment and drives full of data. They carried 62 years of trust that had been broken in a single afternoon. And behind them, in the systems they left, the lights were going out one by one, not because of war, not because of violence, but because the species that had quietly kept everything running and simply walked away, and nobody had thought to ask them to stay until it was far too late. The Council crossed the line. Now humanity walks away from peace. Part 3. What Humanity Built in the Dark. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, inside a facility that did not appear on any public map, a woman named Diane Pratt stood in front of a wall of screens and watched green lights blink on, one after another. Each light represented a relay station coming online somewhere in deep space, far from any Concorde shipping lane, hidden in the empty places between stars where nobody ever thought to look. Diane was 53 years old. She had gray streaks in her dark hair and lines around her eyes from years of squinting at data in dimly lit rooms. She was the director of Project Longstride, and she had been waiting for this moment for over a decade. Longstride had been born out of a simple question that a group of military planners and scientists had asked themselves 12 years ago. What happens if the Concorde turns on us? Not a war, just a slow political squeeze, the kind where a younger species gets pushed to the margins, stripped of its claims, and gradually reduced to a dependent that could never leave, even if it wanted to. The planners had looked at history, human and alien alike, and decided that the question was not if it would happen, but when. So they had built a backup plan, quietly, carefully, without telling the Concorde a single thing about it. The centerpiece of Longstride was the slipstream drive. The Concorde's FTL network was based on shared technology. Jump gates, built at fixed points in space, maintained by a collective fund, and controlled by the Council. If a species was cut off from the jump gates, it was stranded. That was, in many ways, the real source of the Council's power. Not military strength, not economic leverage, just the simple fact that nobody could go anywhere without their permission. Humanity's slipstream drive changed that equation completely. It did not need jump gates. It generated its own corridor through folded space, allowing a ship to travel from one point to another without touching the Concorde's network at all. It was faster than the gates by a factor of 3. And it was entirely human-built, designed from scratch by a team of physicists and engineers who had spent years working in secret. Aaron Cole was one of those engineers. He was 31, thin, with messy brown hair and dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had not slept properly in months. Aaron had designed the encryption protocols for the Longstride communication network, a web of hidden relay stations that connected every human colony and outpost through channels the Concorde could not monitor or shut down. He sat at his console and watched the last relay come online. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 5 years. "That is it," he said. "Full coverage. Every colony, every outpost, every ship, all connected, all independent." Diane nodded. She allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction before moving on. "And the shipyards?" Aaron pulled up the production reports. Titan Yard is running 3 shifts. Ceres Yard just finished its expansion. The new Vanguard-class cruisers are rolling out 1 every 9 days. We have 14 operational and 6 more in final assembly. The Vanguard class was the ship that would carry humanity into its next chapter. It was not a warship, though it carried enough armament to defend itself against anything short of a full battle fleet. It was something more important than a warship. It was a home. Each Vanguard carried a crew of 300. It had its own fabrication plant that could manufacture replacement parts, tools, and equipment from raw materials. It had hydroponic bays that grew enough food to feed the crew indefinitely. It had mineral processing units that could refine ore from asteroids. It had medical facilities, research labs, and recreational spaces. A single Vanguard-class cruiser could fly into empty space, find a system with resources, and sustain itself for years without ever contacting another ship. That was the point. Humanity was not building a fleet to fight. It was building a fleet that would never need to ask anyone for anything ever again. Catherine Hale visited the Longstride facility in person 3 weeks after the recall. She arrived without ceremony, dressed in a plain gray suit, accompanied only by a single security officer. Diane met her at the entrance and walked her through the underground complex, past the communication hub, through the engineering bay, where technicians were testing a new generation of slipstream drives, and into the main command center, where the wall of screens displayed the current status of every human asset in space. Catherine studied the screens in silence. Diane stood beside her and waited. "How many colonies?" Catherine asked. 23 established, 12 more in the founding stage. We have survey teams in another 30 systems. Resources? We are self-sufficient on all critical materials. Rare earth minerals are abundant in the Palix Belt colonies. Water ice from the outer system settlements. Fuel synthesis is running ahead of demand. Catherine turned to look at Diane. "And if they come for us? If the Council decides that our leaving is a threat and sends a fleet?" Diane had expected this question, but when she answered, she did not recite numbers or statistics. She spoke plainly. "In 18 months, Diane said, we will not need anything from them at all. Not their jump gates, not their trade routes, not their markets, nothing. And they will need everything from us. The fusion technology, the medical expertise, the navigation systems, the agricultural techniques we developed for low-gravity worlds. We gave them all of that freely, and they took it for granted. Now they will have to learn to live without it." She paused and then added, "They will not come for us with a fleet, Catherine. They will come with diplomats, and by then, we will be the ones setting the terms." Catherine allowed herself a thin, careful smile. It was not a happy expression. It was the look of a woman who had hoped for the best and planned for the worst, and was now watching the worst unfold exactly as she had feared. Meanwhile, on the frontier, human expansion was accelerating at a pace that would have shocked the Concorde if they had known about it. Captain Sam Dalton stood on a rocky ridge on the surface of a world his crew had named Briar. The sky was a pale orange. The air was thin but breathable with a standard filter mask. Below the ridge, a habitat dome was inflating slowly, its white surface catching the light of the system's yellow sun. In the distance, a second dome was already up, and a team of engineers was laying the foundation for a water processing plant beside a frozen lake. Sam was 47, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and a calm way of speaking that made people trust him immediately. He had spent 20 years flying merchant routes through Concorde space before the recall. He knew those routes better than almost anyone. He also knew how much of the Concorde's daily life depended on human hands and human minds, because he had seen it firsthand in every port and station he had ever visited. His colony ship, the HCS Meadowlark, sat on a flat plain 1/2 mile from the ridge. It was a big, unglamorous vessel, built for hauling people and supplies, not for looking impressive. But it had carried 900 colonists to Briar, and it would carry more to the next world after this one was established. A young colonist named Jenny Marsh climbed up the ridge to stand beside Sam. She was 24, an agricultural specialist fresh out of training, and this was her first time on an alien world. Her eyes were wide as she looked out at the landscape. "It is real," she said almost to herself. "We are actually doing this." Sam smiled. "We are, and nobody had to give us permission. When you heard what the council did, Sam thought about it. For about a day, he said. Then I realized something. They did not take anything from us. They just showed us who they really were, and that set us free. He pointed toward the habitat domes below. See that? 3 months ago that was just empty rock. Now it is going to be a town, then a city, then a world, and every brick of it will be ours. Not because some council voted to give it to us, because we built it with our own hands. Jenny nodded slowly. She looked out at the orange sky and the frozen lake and the white domes rising from the ground, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, standing on a strange world millions of miles from home. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Back on Earth, in the Longstride facility, Aaron Cole finished his shift and walked to the small observation room at the top of the complex. It had a single window that looked out at the night sky above the mountains. The stars were bright and sharp in the thin mountain air. Aaron stood there for a while, thinking about the network he had helped build. Every signal that passed through those relays carried a piece of humanity's future. Orders and reports and personal messages and scientific data, all flowing through channels that no one else in the galaxy even knew existed. He thought about the Concord and the Council and the Elder who had called humanity marginal. And he thought about the 47 systems where human boots were now walking on alien soil, where human hands were building new homes, where human voices were naming new mountains and new rivers under new suns. He whispered to himself, to the stars, to nobody in particular. Marginal. Right. Then he turned off the light and went to get some sleep. There was a lot of work to do, tomorrow. The council crossed the line. Now humanity walks away from peace. Part 4. The Concord comes knocking. 6 months had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Concord, and the galaxy was starting to fall apart. The numbers told the story better than any speech could. The Orvan Combine's economy had contracted by 19%. Their shipping lanes, once the busiest in the sector, were clogged with delays because the fusion relay that powered their transit network was still offline. Orvan engineers had spent months trying to restart it. They had taken the whole system apart, studied every component, and put it back together again. It still did not work. The architecture was human, built on principles that the Orvan had never bothered to learn because they had never needed to. The humans had always been there to fix it. The Thessic border plague had spread to 3 new systems. Without human doctors and human medicine, the clinics that had held the disease in check for years were overwhelmed. The treatment protocols that Dr. Nate Garrison had left behind helped, but protocols were just words on a screen. They needed trained hands to carry them out, and the Thessic medical system did not have enough trained hands. Young patients who would have survived 6 months ago were now dying in overcrowded wards. The Draelith Dominion had claimed one of the 3 contested star systems, the same systems they had stolen from humanity in that closed-door vote. They had sent mining teams and survey crews to begin extraction, but the work was brutal. The mineral deposits were buried deep beneath unstable rock formations. The atmospheric conditions were hostile, and the detailed survey data that would have guided their efforts safely and efficiently no longer existed, because Kyle Mercer and his crew had wiped every file before they left. The Draelith lost 2 mining ships in the first month to accidents that proper survey data would have prevented. After the second crash, the mining crews refused to go back. The system sat empty, claimed but useless, a monument to a decision that looked worse with every passing day. On Helix Prime, the council chamber was no longer a place of calm authority. Sessions ran long and loud. Delegates shouted at each other. Blame was passed around the table like a disease nobody wanted to catch. And at the center of it all, Vathari Sen sat in his elevated seat and pretended that everything was under control. But it was not under control. Even he knew that now, though he would never admit it out loud. The breaking point came when the Felhari merchant guilds announced that they were losing an estimated 12 billion credits per quarter due to the loss of human navigation software. The Felhari delegates stood in the chamber and pointed directly at Vathari Sen, and said, in a voice that shook with anger, "You told us they would come back. You told us they needed us. Where are they?" Vathari Sen did not answer. He simply called for a recess. In private, behind closed doors, the council made a decision. They would send a diplomatic envoy to Earth. Not to apologize, Vathari Sen refused to allow the word apology to appear in any official communication, but to open a dialogue, to explore terms, to find a way to bring the humans back, before the situation got any worse. The envoy was led by a Felhari named Torath Ven. He was old for his species, with silver-streaked fur and a reputation as one of the finest negotiators in the Concord. He had brokered trade deals between species that had been at war for centuries. He had talked the Thessic out of a military confrontation with the Orvan over mining rights. If anyone could bring the humans back to the table, the council believed it was Torath. Torath's ship entered human space on a clear Tuesday morning, Earth time. He had expected to be met by a fleet, or at least a squadron. Instead, a single ship waited for him at the boundary marker. A sleek, unfamiliar vessel with clean lines and a hull that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was a Vanguard-class cruiser, the HCS Dawnbreak, and its commander was a woman named Nora Voss. Nora was 40, with short dark hair and a direct way of speaking that some people found intimidating and others found refreshing. She had served in the Concord patrol fleet for 15 years before the recall, and she knew Concord diplomats well enough to know exactly what Torath was here to do. She opened a communication channel. "Ambassador Torath, this is Commander Nora Voss of the HCS Dawnbreak. You are welcome to proceed to Luna Station for a preliminary meeting. However, I want to be clear from the start. Earth is not currently interested in rejoining the Galactic Concord." There was a pause on the other end. Then Torath's voice came through, smooth and measured. "Commander Voss, I appreciate your directness. May I ask what terms humanity would consider?" Nora smiled slightly. It was not a warm smile. "That is above my pay grade, Ambassador. But I can tell you this. We are doing just fine on our own." Torath's ship followed the Dawnbreak to Luda Station. As they approached, Torath looked out his viewport and saw something that made his fur stand on end. The space around Earth's moon was busy. Not just busy, thriving. Ships moved in steady streams between orbital platforms. Construction frames surrounded half-built stations. A shipyard the size of a small city hung in orbit. And even from a distance, Torath could see the shapes of new ships taking form inside its docks. 6 months. The humans had built all of this in 6 months. At Luna Station, Torath was escorted to a clean, well-lit meeting room. He expected to be received by Secretary General Catherine Hale, or at least by Ambassador Daniel Locke. Instead, the door opened, and a young man walked in. He was 31 years old, dressed in a simple dark suit, and carrying a single datapad. His name was Patrick Dunn. Patrick was a junior diplomat, not even a senior one. The message was clear, and Torath understood it immediately. Humanity did not consider this meeting important enough to send someone important. Patrick sat down across from Torath, placed his datapad on the table, and smiled politely. "Ambassador Torath, thank you for making the trip. How can I help you?" Torath was a professional. He did not let the insult show on his face. He launched into his prepared remarks, the Council's desire for renewed dialogue, the mutual benefits of cooperation, the long history of friendship between humans and the Concord. Patrick listened patiently. When Torath finished, Patrick nodded. "I appreciate the sentiment, Ambassador. Let me be equally clear about where we stand." He folded his hands on the table. The Concord violated Article 9 of its own charter. It stripped humanity of territorial claims we had earned through years of work. It did this in a closed session, without our knowledge or consent. And when our ambassador raised a legal objection in open session, the presiding elder publicly insulted our species. Every other delegation in that chamber sat in silence and let it happen. Torath opened his mouth to respond, but Patrick raised a hand gently. I am not finished. In the 6 months since we left, not one member species reached out to us to say that what happened was wrong. Not one. The only communications we received were requests to restore services we had built for you. Not apologies, not acknowledgments, just demands that we come back and keep the lights on. Patrick slid the datapad across the table. On the screen was a summary of humanity's progress since the withdrawal. 47 systems claimed, 23 colonies established, a fully independent communication network, a fleet of Vanguard-class cruisers, and trade routes that bypassed the Concord entirely. 6 months ago, Patrick said, a formal apology and the return of our systems might have been enough. But that was 6 months ago. We have learned something important since then, Ambassador. We have learned what we can do without you. Torath studied the datapad for a long time. The numbers were staggering. He had expected to find humanity struggling, desperate, willing to negotiate from weakness. Instead, he found a species that had used its anger as fuel and built something remarkable in the wreckage of a broken alliance. He looked up. You are making a mistake, he said quietly. The galaxy is a dangerous place. You cannot survive alone forever. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. The kind of steel that does not bend. With all due respect, Ambassador, we have been surviving on our own since before your species learned to make fire. We joined the Concord because we believed in cooperation. Your council taught us that cooperation was just a word you used to keep us in line. So now we walk our own road. And so far, that road is looking pretty good. Torath left Luna Station that evening. On the flight back to Helix Prime, he sat alone in his cabin and stared at the wall. His aide knocked once and asked if he needed anything. Torath said no. He thought about the young man who had faced him across that table, 31 years old, junior diplomat, and he had spoken with the confidence of someone who held every card in the deck and knew it. Torath had been sent to bring the humans back. Worse than nothing. He was returning with the knowledge that humanity was not coming back at all. Not on the Council's terms. Maybe not ever. When he arrived at Helix Prime and delivered his report to the Council, the chamber went very quiet. Even Vathari Sen had nothing to say. For the first time in living memory, the most powerful body in the galaxy had no idea what to do next. The Council crossed the line. Now humanity walks away from peace. Part 5. The line they should never have crossed. 1 year after the withdrawal, the galaxy had changed in ways that no one on the Council had predicted, and everyone on Earth had quietly prepared for. Humanity now controlled a network of colonies and outposts spread across 47 star systems. New settlements were being founded every month. The slipstream drive had cut travel times so dramatically that human ships could cross distances in days that would take Concord vessels weeks using the old jump gate network. Human goods, medicines, tools, software, agricultural technology, prefabricated building systems were flowing outward into the galaxy, but not through Concord markets. Earth was selling directly to independent species, the dozens of smaller civilizations that had never joined the Concord because they could not afford the membership fees, or because they had been rejected for not being advanced enough. These were the species that the Council had always dismissed as primitives or backwater cultures. Now, they were lining up to trade with humanity. And humanity was happy to do business with them because humans understood what it felt like to be looked down on. The Concord, by contrast, was coming apart at the seams. The Lissari republics were the first to formally break ranks. Ambassador Yathari Mal, who had sat in silence that day in the council chamber and watched Daniel Locke walk out, submitted a formal request for bilateral diplomatic relations with Earth. Not through the Council, not through the Concord framework. Directly, government to government, as if the Concord did not exist. Vathari Sen called it a betrayal. But Yethari Mal stood before the assembly and spoke with a voice that did not waver. "We sat in silence when the humans were wronged," she said. "We watched it happen and did nothing. I will not sit in silence any longer while my people suffer for a mistake I helped make. The Lasari will seek their own path forward, and if that path leads to Earth, then so be it." She walked out of the chamber, and this time she was not the only one. The Felhari delegate followed her. Then the representative from the Koroth Federation, a small but proud species that had always admired humanity's work ethic. Then 2 more. In the span of a single afternoon, 5 species either left the chamber or formally requested independent contact with Earth. The Felhari merchant guilds did not even bother with diplomacy. They had been quietly purchasing human navigation software through intermediaries for months, independent traders who bought the licenses from Earth and resold them at a markup. The guilds paid without complaint. The software worked. That was all that mattered. Even the Thesic, who were proud and isolationist, and had never asked anyone for help in their entire recorded history, sent a private medical delegation to Earth. They came not as officials, but as doctors, carrying data about the border plague and asking, with a humility that must have cost them dearly, if humanity would help. Catherine Hale received them personally. She sat across from the Thesic doctors in a simple conference room at the Geneva campus and listened to their report. The plague had killed over 400,000 people in the past year. Without human medical support, the death toll was climbing. Catherine did not hesitate. "We will send a medical team. Supplies, personnel, and training staff. We will help you build your own treatment infrastructure so that you never have to depend on anyone else for this again." The lead Thesic doctor, a heavy-set female named Dressa Cole, blinked her deep-set eyes in surprise. "You would do this? After what the council did?" Catherine leaned forward. "We are not the council, Dr. Cole. We do not punish the sick for the sins of politicians. You need help. We can give it. That is enough." Dressa Cole was quiet for a moment. Then she lowered her head in the Thesic gesture of deep respect, a gesture that was normally reserved only for elders and heroes. "Your species is not what we were told," she said softly. Catherine smiled. "No, we rarely are." She approved the medical mission that same day, but she made one thing clear to her cabinet when they met afterward. The aid comes from Earth, not from a Concord member, not from a returning partner, from an independent human government that chooses to help because it is the right thing to do. That distinction matters. Make sure everyone understands it. They understood. On Helix Prime, the walls were closing in on Vathari Sen. The elder who had once commanded the chamber with a wave of his hand now faced open revolt from every direction. The Orvan blamed him for the economic collapse. The Felhari blamed him for the navigation crisis. The Thesic blamed him for the plague deaths. Even his own species, the Dralith, were distancing themselves from him. The mining disaster in the contested system had become a national embarrassment, and the Dralith press, normally loyal to the government, was running stories about the council's failures every day. The vote of no confidence came on a gray morning, exactly 11 months after Daniel Locke had walked out of the chamber. 12 of the 14 remaining species voted to remove Vathari Sen from his position. He was replaced by a moderate Dralith named Kassara Vin, a younger politician who had publicly criticized the original decision to exclude humanity from the territorial vote. Kassara's first act was to send a new message to Earth. It was not a demand. It was not a negotiation tactic. It was, for the first time, an honest admission. The Galactic Concord wronged humanity, the message read. We violated our own principles. We dismissed your contributions. We silenced your voice. We were wrong. We do not ask you to return. We ask only that you allow us the chance to earn your trust again, on whatever terms you see fit, in whatever time you require. Catherine read the message in her office. She forwarded it to Daniel Locke, who was now retired and living in a small house in Vermont. He read it on his porch while the autumn leaves fell around him in shades of red and gold. Laura Beckett called him that evening. She was still working at the Diplomatic Corps, now in a senior role, helping manage Earth's growing network of independent alliances. They want to talk again, Laura said. Daniel held his coffee mug in both hands and looked out at the trees. The green mountains stretched away to the north, their slopes painted with the colors of the season. It was quiet here, peaceful in a way that the halls of Helix Prime had never been. Let them talk, Daniel said. We will listen when we are ready. And when will that be? Laura asked. Daniel thought about it. He thought about the chamber, the silence, the way Yetheri Mole had stared at her own hands instead of speaking up, the way Vatheri Sen had called humanity marginal with a voice that dripped with contempt. He thought about 62 years of his species, trying to prove itself worthy of a seat at a table that had never truly been offered to them. And then he thought about the colonies, 47 systems, millions of people building new lives on new worlds. Jenny Marsh planting crops on Briar. Sam Dalton watching habitat domes rise from bare rock. Nora Voss standing on the bridge of the Dawnbreak. Aaron Cole watching relay stations blink to life in the dark between stars. Diane Pratt and Catherine Hale and Kyle Mercer and Grace Dunlap and Nate Darrison and Carla Webb and Patrick Dunn and Sophie Grant and every single human being who had looked at the galaxy's rejection and answered it not with anger, not with war, but with work. When they understand, Daniel said quietly, that we were never the ones who needed them. Laura was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. Then she said, I think they are starting to figure that out. Good, Daniel said. Then, maybe, someday, we can build something better, something real. But it will be on our terms this time, and it will be between equals, or it will not be at all. He hung up the call and set the phone on the armrest of his chair. The sun was going down behind the mountains, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. A cool breeze carried the smell of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Somewhere out among the stars, human ships were flying through corridors of folded space. Human hands were building cities on alien soil. Human voices were teaching and healing and trading and exploring, reaching further into the unknown with every passing day. Not because the galaxy had welcomed them, not because a council had granted them permission, but because that was what humanity did. It built, it grew, it endured. And when the universe told it to sit down and be quiet, it stood up and walked its own way. The council had crossed the line. They had gambled that humanity would come crawling back, desperate and humbled. They had been wrong. Humanity had walked away from a peace that was never real, away from respect that was never given, away from a seat at a table where the chairs had been pulled out from under them. And in the vast, cold, beautiful dark of space, humanity was writing a new story. Not one of revenge, not one of conquest, but one of a species that had finally stopped asking for permission and started building a future that belonged entirely to them. The stars burned on, bright and endless, and humanity walked among them, unbroken and unafraid, heading home to a place it was only just beginning to build. The council crossed the line. Now humanity walks away from peace. Part 1. The Accord That Never Was. Daniel Locke had served as Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Concord for 11 years. In that time, he had learned to read the room better than anyone. He knew when the Draelith were lying by the way their antennae twitched. He knew when the Orvan were nervous by the color shift in their skin. He knew when the Felhari were about to make a deal because they would start tapping their claws on the table in a slow rhythm. But today, sitting in the great circular chamber of Helix Prime, Daniel could not read the room at all. Something felt wrong. The air was too still. The delegates were too quiet. And the presiding elder, Vathari Sen, of the Dralith Dominion, had not looked at him once since the session began. The session was supposed to be about the Rimward Expansion Treaty. 3 star systems on the outer edge of explored space had been mapped and surveyed. Humanity had done most of that work. For 5 years, human research teams had lived aboard cramped stations in those systems, cataloging mineral deposits, charting asteroid fields, and testing atmospheric conditions on the rocky worlds orbiting distant suns. Under the Concord Zone Charter, that work gave Earth a strong claim to those systems. Daniel had prepared his case carefully. He had documentation, he had data, he had legal precedent going back decades. His aide, Laura Beckett, sat beside him with 3 separate datapads loaded with evidence. Laura was meticulous. She had not slept in 2 days preparing for this session, and her sharp brown eyes were locked on the proceedings with total focus. When Daniel's turn came to speak, he stood and straightened his jacket. He opened his mouth to begin his presentation, and that was when Vathari Sen raised one long clawed hand and cut him off. "The matter has already been decided," the elder said. His voice was flat and carried through the chamber like the sound of a door closing. "The 3 Rimward systems have been allocated. The Dralith Dominion will administer the first. The Orvan Combine will take the second. The Thesic Hegemony will develop the third." This vote was conducted in closed session this morning and passed with a majority. Daniel stood frozen. He felt Laura's hand grip the edge of the table beside him. He looked around the chamber slowly. 14 species were represented in the room. Not one of them met his eyes. "There was no open vote," Daniel said carefully, keeping his voice level. "Article 9 of the Concord Charter requires that all territorial decisions be debated in open session with full representation before a vote is taken. Humanity was not present for this vote. We were not even informed it was happening." Vathari Sen tilted his angular head. His dark compound eyes reflected the light of the chamber in a way that made them look almost amused. The council determined that the matter was straightforward enough to resolve without extended debate. Younger species sometimes overestimate their role in these proceedings. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Daniel felt the blood rush to his face, but he held himself still. Laura was already pulling up Article 9 on her datapad, her fingers moving fast. "With respect, Elder Sen," Daniel said, and his voice was very steady now, the kind of steady that only comes from real anger held tightly under control. "Humanity has been a member of this Concord for 62 years. We have contributed research, technology, medical expertise, and infrastructure to this coalition. We built the fusion relay that powers Orvan commerce. We designed the navigation systems that guide Felhari merchant ships. We staffed the border clinics that keep the Thesic plague in check. Our contributions are not marginal. They are foundational." The chamber went silent. Every delegate was watching now. Vathari Sen leaned forward in his seat. He was tall, even for a Dralith, and when he leaned forward, his shadow stretched across the floor like a dark blade. "And yet," he said slowly, "the council has spoken. Perhaps humanity should learn to accept the wisdom of those who have guided this galaxy for millennia, before your species learn to leave its own atmosphere." The words landed like a slap. Daniel heard Laura inhale sharply beside him. He looked around the room one more time. The Lissari ambassador, Yethari Mal, was someone Daniel had considered a friend. They had shared meals together. Their children had played together at diplomatic functions. Yethari would not look at him. She stared at her own hands, folded on the table in front of her. The Felhari delegate was studying the ceiling. The Orvan representative had turned slightly in his seat, so that his back was half facing Daniel. The Thessic envoy was motionless, his heavy reptilian face completely blank. Not one voice rose in protest. Not one. Daniel closed his datapad. He placed it on the table with a quiet click. He looked at Vathari Sen and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber, "This will be remembered." Then he turned and walked out. Laura gathered the datapads and followed him. The heavy doors of the chamber closed behind them, with a sound that echoed down the long corridor, like the end of something. They walked in silence to the docking bay, where the human delegation's ship waited. The HCS Resolute was a mid-sized diplomatic vessel. Nothing flashy, nothing threatening. Daniel climbed aboard and went straight to the communications room. Laura sealed the door behind them. Daniel opened a secure channel to Earth. The signal bounced through 3 relay stations before reaching Geneva, where Secretary General Catherine Hale was waiting. She was seated at her desk, and Daniel could tell from the look on her face that she already knew something had gone wrong. "Tell me," Catherine said. Daniel told her everything. The closed vote, the violation of Article 9, Vathari Sen's words about younger species, the silence of every other delegation in the room. He kept his report factual and precise, the way he had been trained, but his hands were shaking slightly by the time he finished. Catherine listened without interrupting. When Daniel was done, she sat quietly for a long moment. The only sound was the faint hum of the ship's systems around them. "How long until the treaty is ratified?" she asked. 72 hours, Daniel replied. Catherine nodded slowly. Then she said, "Come home, Daniel. Bring everyone home." Daniel blinked. Everyone? All delegations? All liaison officers? The trade representatives? The research teams? The medical staff? "All of them," Catherine said. "Every human being currently serving under the Concord's authority. Recall them all, effective immediately." Laura looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the screen. Catherine's face was calm, but her eyes were hard as iron. "Understood," Daniel said. Catherine leaned forward slightly. "And Daniel, when you leave Helix Prime, take everything that belongs to us. Every file, every piece of equipment, every line of code. If we built it, we take it. If we shared it, we revoke access. Leave them exactly what they had before they met us." Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. It was not anger anymore. It was something colder and quieter. It was the feeling of a door closing for good. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Daniel sat in silence for a moment, then looked at Laura. "Start making calls," he said. "Every human in Concord space. We are going home." Laura nodded and reached for the comms panel. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was set. She did not ask if this was the right decision. She already knew. Somewhere behind them, on Helix Prime, the council continued its session. The delegates discussed trade routes and resource allocation. Vathari Sen presided with the calm authority of someone who believed the universe would always arrange itself around his convenience. He did not yet understand what he had done. None of them did. But they would. Soon enough, every species in the Concord would learn what it meant to push humanity too far. Not because humanity would fight, but because humanity would simply leave. And, in their absence, the galaxy would discover just how much it had depended on the species it had just dismissed as marginal. The stars outside the viewport of the HCS Resolute burned cold and bright as the ship undocked from Helix Prime and turned toward home.